conference, the monetary policy, especially the RMB exchange rate. He mentioned several factors that might eventually influence the decision coming from the central bank in terms of its interactions in the market. One of the things he specifically said, the market, especially the international economic situation, has been evolving, and China is part of it. Obviously, he's not suggesting China is going to be an exception, but rather everything goes with the rest of the world, so is vice versa. So in a way, it seemed to be a very observing attitude rather than a definite response, Professor Guo.
Zhou Xiaochuan knows his priorities. I think in terms
What is his priority according to you, do you think?
Well, specifically exchange rate. Okay, of course, the financial stability and so on and so forth, those are important, but specifically exchange rate. And then, if we want to compare the exchange rate with circuit breaker, I would say, oh, sure, exchange rate is much more important.
Absolutely.
So, as long as once you have that priority set up in, say, in Zhou Xiaochuan's mind, and once he can communicate that with the market, everybody, well, in the world investors they're going to listen. So they know what Chinese officials or at least financial these guys, regulatory authorities, they are heading for. And once the priority is clear, and then the real economy is important, and the circuit breaker becomes trendy words. But that's not.
Since you talk about the priority, let's move on to another set of important questions. Also in interaction with what's going on at the press conferences over the weekend. That is, what are China's priorities? That's a big question mark for many other investors coming from overseas. Mr. Ross, I'm sure you have some thoughts about this. Some have been suggesting China has several priorities, all at the same time juggling with the three of them. First is economic growth rate, as you mentioned, from 6.5 to 7%, this range that has been stated in the government work report by the Chinese premier. Second, of course, social stability. That's always been a must for Chinese policymakers. And third, structural reform, especially supply-side structural reform. So these three all tied up at the same time. But can that be all achieved with different sets of policies? Mr. Ross.
Yeah, the answer I would give is yes, but I should explain why. Firstly, I just want to very much endorse the view that while I think the circuit breaker was a bit of a spectacular but not terribly important, the statements on the central bank on the RMB exchange rate were extremely important, and I think they had a stabilising effect on the market. The fundamental there is there will of course be short-term fluctuations, but there is no economic basis for a substantial, by which I would define as more than 5% either way, devaluation of the RMB. Secondly, that's the first thing, because all international investors are affected by the exchange rate, so that's decisive. Second, will China hit its 6.5% growth target? The answer I would give is yes, for fundamental economic reasons. The growth rate in the economy is determined by two fundamental factors. One is how much of the economy is invested, which in China is more than 40%. And secondly, how efficient is that investment in generating growth? Actually, it's not generally known that the efficiency of investment of China in generating growth is higher than the United States. And there's no reason, therefore, taking those fundamental macroeconomic parameters, why China should not hit the 6.5% growth rate. Incidentally, more important than the 6.5% to 7% growth rate for this year is the 6.5% over the entire plan, because that gives stability to people who are thinking of investing in China.
All right, but my question really has a lot to do with what they say, killing two birds with one stone. Can we kill three birds with one stone? That is the question, Professor Zhu.
I think my answer would be yes too, but I think it will be a very hard yes. While I think through a structural reform we could achieve those three goals at the same time, but then it is not easy to have those reform implemented for a couple of reasons. One is we have those vested interest group who will be resisting any reforms. Secondly, we have already faced some significant slowdown in economic growth, which makes the government have less resources, and also make it harder to push forward further reforms, for example, the RMB internationalization reform. So I think it is going to be hinging upon whether or how fast China is